Once we have a good working definition of culture, we can move on to defining intercultural competence. Intercultural competence has a few elements. First, it contains the term culture, which we've defined already in another place. But what is interculture? That needs to be defined. Then we also need to define competence as well. We need to define interculture as a term differentiating it from cross-culture. Well, we don't need to, but I like to. Cross-culture, in my mind, is more specific as to the knowledge base about a specific other culture, C2, which is particular to that second culture. So cross-cultural competence would be limited to my own ability to cross into Russian culture, for example. I have a modicum of fluency in Russian and have specific knowledge of the culture and how people in the culture interact, so as to have a cross-cultural competence in Russian culture. The intercultural, however, is a broader, more neutral competence, I like to think. Being able to interact in intercultural spaces demands broader knowledge of culture and to be effective in more than one other culture. Conflicts occur often in the realm of culture when crossing cultures or when living or working in intercultural spaces. To some degree, a person can conflict with their own first culture by their own personal preferences or ways of being that are somewhat personal, somewhat familial or ethnic, and somewhat locally cultural. One's ability to live in close proximity to others is conditioned on where one is from and what one is used to. I am from rural Minnesota. My ability to be comfortable in a crowded subway train or on a bus in India is very different than the locals of those places where close physical proximity is normal and there's a lot of expected touching and what I would consider to be invasion of my personal space. There is terminology for other aspects of culture as well, such as Gelfand et al.'s use of the terms tight and loose, or Hall's somewhat more opaque terms of low context versus high context cultures. Other presentations will delve further into these too. We are trying to define intercultural competence here, after all. Intercultural conflicts occur between tight and loose cultures or between high and low context cultures, where culture is the cause or main culprit in the conflict. Let's look at this further. Intercultural spaces, which need to be defined, are the main places where you would expect to find intercultural conflict. These spaces are where more than two cultures come together. If it is only between two cultures, I would call that cross-cultural conflict, which is easier to deal with. These conflicts often occur without our realizing that there is a conflict or realizing that the conflict is cultural. These can be simple or very complex cultural complications leading to conflict. When we feel uncomfortable, offended, and angry at someone from another culture and we don't know why, that's probably based on a cultural difference that is an intercultural conflict. We start with very simple forms of intercultural conflict and move towards the more complex in our future presentations. These conflicts occur in intercultural spaces where people from more than two cultures collide, like three icebergs colliding underwater. Where two cultures collide, as I've said, we have cross-cultural conflict in the cross-cultural space, as you can see here on the slide. But the intercultural space or interculture, I'll define as that space or place where more than two cultures come into contact. How do cultures come into contact? Well, they don't. It's where one or more people of a first culture are in contact with one or more people from another culture, second culture, and a third culture, which is also a second culture. They come and interact with one another. At any point in the interactions of these people, which we can understand as an intercultural space, we can find cultures in intercultural conflict. This diagram clarifies the difference between cross-culture and interculture in the way that I define and use those terms. Cultures come into conflict because the way a person of one culture processes information and behavioral information with their own frameworks and reference system has a culturally determined set of expectations about the behaviors that are normal, acceptable, and effective. A person from another culture different from the other's first culture, has an equal number of frameworks and systems that determine the competence in that culture. So whenever one or more first culture persons come into contact with one or more people from a second culture, there will be culturally determined interpretations of behaviors and communication, even if they have linguistic proficiency in the other's language. And this will result in conflicts, often under the surface and therefore not apparently obvious to either of the cultural groups. That this cross-cultural conflict, whereas if we add another culture into the mix, we have the potential for intercultural conflict. Intercultural competence is the knowledge, skills, and abilities to anticipate and deal with these expected and necessary conflicts. So let's review once again my definition of intercultural competence with this in mind. I define intercultural competence as cultural and intercultural understanding. We have already defined culture and identified it as the source of a variety of conflicts. Understanding the nature of culture and interculture are the first concepts in this definition. Understanding which is a faculty of the mind brings knowledge and experience together, which, along with time to reflect critically, results in intercultural understanding. Out of that, intercultural skills grow. Attitudes change from that person is offensive to that other person is not trying to offend me. But it's the person's culture that helps me understand why the person is behaving that way. With that knowledge, our actions become more effective because they're perceived as appropriate. And especially because how we act is being equally perceived by the other as offensive or at least strange. These conflicts are anticipated in intercultural contexts, which I have also defined in this video. So that's it. That's my complex definition of intercultural competence, the result of which is a more neutral way of acting effectively and appropriately and knowing when to do so. What remains is to talk about what knowledge, beyond the definitions covered here and in previous videos, is required to better understand and to gain more experience in cross-cultural and intercultural spaces to learn how to act more appropriately and effectively. That's the stuff of future presentations. While I use these videos as presentations for the courses I teach on intercultural competence, they're also freely available for anybody to watch. So please feel free to like it or subscribe to this channel as you see fit, or share it. Your feedback is valuable to me to make sure things are clear, and may you find the peace you're looking for.